Today I am building the ultimate Windows ME computer. Well, almost. I did have to make at least one compromise there. I'll explain why, but for the most part, this build will make use of a rather unusual hardware configuration. It'll put Windows ME's full glory on display and prove why it is a worthy successor in the Windows 9X lineup. At the heart of this build is an Asus CUBX-E motherboard, which is a really late model to be using Intel's 440BX chipset. The chipset in question was first available to consumers in 1998, but the CUBX-E was released in 2000. Why would a fresh new motherboard be using such a dated chipset? It turns out, the 440BX has some hidden superpowers which would become more readily apparent with time. It had already broke new ground with its native 100 MHz frontside bus, narrowing the speed gap between the CPU and the rest of the system. But it turns out that in some cases, it can even perform reliably at 133 MHz. All that's really needed to make this happen is to use a CPU designed for this bus speed, use only PC 133 SDRAM, and do not use an AGP card. For whatever reason, the 440BX chipset happens to have a 1/4 divider for the PCI bus to keep it operating at its normal, healthy speed, but no such appropriate divider exists for AGP at this speed. Although chipset heatsinks have become more prevalent with the 440BX, they were very minimal. Usually peg-mounted heatsinks didn't have any thermal compound at all. As this chipset will be overclocked, I want to assure its stability by using a copper cooler for it instead, with some Arctic MX4 thermal paste. It's likely an extreme measure, but for such a prestigious build being pushed so far, I would prefer to give it the best treatment it can possibly get. By the time new Pentium 3 CPUs with the Coppermine core were being shipped in late 1999, existing 440BX motherboards could not operate with them natively, but later revisions were designed to do so. Furthermore, with their cache memory now being fully integrated into the CPU die and running at full speed, the classic socket design was coming back in style, this time for good. This CUBX-E motherboard was specifically designed around this trend, scaling the 440BX chipset to greater heights with the convenience of not needing a socket adapter. Well, that is unless you want to push this platform even further with a 2 core CPU from 2001 or 2002. That's what I'm going to be using for this build, a 1.4 GHz Pentium 3 2. It happens to require a 133 MHz frontside bus to operate at its full speed, due to these CPUs having locked multipliers. If you would rather not push your computer that far, a 1.4 GHz Celeron can be used with a 100 MHz bus speed instead. To better assure that the motherboard can operate with the 2 CPU, you always want to try to update the BIOS to the latest release if possible. Even if said release is a beta, you can do this from the computer itself, but in case of a disaster, you may have an easier time simply using an external programmer. After the CPU is installed, the memory ought to come next. Again, PC 133 memory is necessary to operate reliably with the overclocked chipset. So far, I've shown these installation procedures outside of a case for photographic clarity, but it's time to reintroduce a leftover case. I settled on this one primarily for the large rear exhaust fan, which should pull more heat away from the CPU, in addition to the very modern power supply, which I will secure in place with magic.
Instaprize!
The case has a detachable motherboard tray. Although it's not as fancy as an in-wind tower where the expansion slots slide out with it, it's definitely a convenient means to fasten the motherboard to the case. Before installing any devices, I prefer to make the essential connections for ATX power in the case's front panel buttons and lights up front. The latter can especially be finicky in tight spots. Surely one wouldn't forget the front intake fan, right? The computer will take a 20 GB IDE hard drive, which should be practical for the majority of Windows 9X installations unless you have an impossible number of programs you want to load. Here's where things get a bit anticlimactic. I was going to try using my PCI Voodoo5 video card that I happen to have. It would have arguably been one of the best options for avoiding the AGP bus. It partially worked. I could boot to a GUI in high color, but when I actually tried to run a 3D game, the whole system locked up. I was trying to repair it by adding some tiny capacitors, taking the places of a couple which supposedly broke off when I got them. They were C504 and C528 by the looks of it. On a German forum there is a capacitor list for the AGP variant, but not the PCI one. I don't have a secondary equivalent to compare. Good luck trying to get one these days. In the end, I settled on a Nvidia GeForce FX 5200, running directly contrary to the cool factor, but it works and provides decent enough power for older software. The rest is trivial. As far as networking goes, a computer with this power could benefit somewhat from Gigabit networking. For that, you really can't go wrong with the Intel Pro 1000 GT. It's got drivers on a scale similar to 3Com's prized Fast Etherlink XL series. It has drivers for Windows ME, 98SC, and even NT 4.0. If there was a way to get it working with Windows 95, it would be perfection. Last but not least, it ought to be nice to make use of the ISA slots this motherboard has, something which would be phased out shortly after this chipset's prime. A Sound Blaster AWE64 will suffice. Now for the external expansion bays. I want a fully complete system here, so in addition to the obligatory 3.5-inch floppy drive and CD-ROM drive, this computer will also get one of the 5.25-inch floppy drives that I have. I certainly don't use these much, but they've absolutely come in handy for archiving programs which previously haven't been available online. Once everything is connected, the BIOS will ask to set a new CPU speed in there, as it's configured for jumperless operation. As the speed I'm going for is out of spec, the desired setting will have to be configured manually. Make sure to select the option which sets the PCI frequency to 33 MHz so it's running at a safe level. With that, it's time to install Windows ME. Normally I would install it over a local area network, but I'm going to settle for the old-fashioned way so I can show you one of Windows ME's defining advantages. So, we've got sound already, but no networking. We're stuck using a default video driver and a 16-bit disk driver since I've connected the hard drive to the Promise controller. So, we should load some drivers with, yes, a flash drive. Windows ME natively supports any generic USB mass storage device, provided it's formatted as FAT32 or even FAT16. Even one you buy today will work, though it's best practice to stick to a capacity of 32 GB or less. I wasn't able to use my flash drive with my keyboard's integrated hub, as it's very limited in its power delivery. Still, plugging it into the back will load the content straight away after first-time initialization of the driver. Once the drivers for my devices are loaded, so are a number of useful programs like Office 2000 and Quake. Even without the Voodoo5 at play, this system proves to be very powerful and makes for a fascinating bridge between the eras with its broad support for a wide variety of hardware. Now, I have a full video already detailing the great advantages of Windows ME, but I think it's worth reiterating them briefly. One of the top complaints of this operating system is its removal of real mode MS-DOS and support for real mode DOS drivers. By this late stage, when more computers were being sold with very powerful hardware and upgraded systems could reasonably be expected to have similar headroom, there was no longer a need to use MS-DOS mode to maximize performance as there would have been on early platforms like the 486. Any DOS programs which couldn't run correctly under here probably couldn't work well in 95 or 98 either. No matter how you look at it, DOS Windows and Windows ME are much better than the shaky NTVDM from Windows XP. So really all the complaints about Windows ME not having MS-DOS mode are complete bullshit. Drivers seem to be the other thing, spawning the allegations of Windows ME's supposedly unique instability. This is also not true. Some of its problems are inherent to the Windows 9X kernel, and shell, mind you. Even then, it just so happened to mitigate at least a few of them, including the notorious con crash command. The other half has to do with the shift over to WDM as opposed to traditional VXD drivers from classic Windows. Microsoft made it clear to vendors that WDM was the way forward and gave them plenty of time to develop new drivers for Windows ME under this model, but many did not bother. Windows ME could still interface with VXDs to some extent, but as with the removal of most real-mode DOS components, this capacity was stripped down. The idea was always to shift over to WDM for greater robustness, but if you try to rely on VXDs so much for sound, modems, or the like, you're not going to have a good time. But even Windows 98 and 95 are generally reliable if you use good hardware and good drivers. Meanwhile, a poorly written driver for Windows NT can easily bring the whole system down. WDM has been around even as early as Windows 95B with a USB supplement, albeit to an extremely limited capacity until Windows 98. I happen to know this from having read a text file in one of the Windows driver development kits. So there's been plenty of time to adapt to WDM all around. Windows ME had started development as early as late 1998, which would make it around a 2-year cycle, which is pretty typical of a Windows operating system around that time. Rule of thumb: don't lazily blame Windows 9X for anything when you can trace it down to a bad driver or configuration. Then there's the notion that Windows ME offered nothing over 98, which is also a bogus claim. Why do you think every Windows release has to proudly advertise new features? I've already shown its native USB mass storage driver, but it also carries over plenty of quality of life enhancements from Windows 2000 shell and introduces some of its own. These conveniently get ignored so Windows XP can be put on a pedestal. Windows ME is a fantastic operating system, and you would know this for yourself if you actually tried to use it beyond a bare installation in VirtualBox. I've even seen it being settled on in one of my friend's Socket 7 computers where none of the other options seemed to work, and it excelled. It is far from useless, and in fact is a far better system than the successor which was supposed to fix it. Seriously, if you're still out there telling everyone that Windows ME is the worst operating system ever, you really do not know what you are talking about, because after all, Windows 11 is right in front of you. So, you should use Windows ME in your next old computer and see the difference for yourself.